A voice runs every decision made today, and it isn't the one anyone thinks it is. A character gets performed right now, kept alive only because it once earned applause nobody's willing to give up. A ruler gets used to measure an entire life, except it was never built, never calibrated, for the life it's measuring. And somewhere close by, a specific person triggers irritation for reasons that have nothing to do with them at all, and everything to do with a mirror nobody wants to look into. None of that sounds like focus on yourself. It sounds like therapy. It sounds like something far too uncomfortable for a Tuesday afternoon. But stick around for a second, because here's the part almost nobody explains correctly. Every one of those things, the borrowed voice, the addictive character, the wrong ruler, the accusing mirror, they all trace back to the exact same root. A person who never learned where their own thoughts end and everyone else's begin. A person running someone else's program and calling it free will. This isn't another video about self-care, boundaries, or positive affirmations. It's about something stranger. Why silence works like a precision instrument. Why real discipline only proves itself when nobody's watching. Why the applause chased before doing anything quietly steers the outcome before it even starts. And why being completely forgettable to almost everyone might be the most liberating thing a person ever allows themselves to become. 10 ideas, each one uncomfortable in its own specific way. Each one pointing toward the same final, simple, almost dangerous question. Who exactly has been running this life? And what happens the moment that finally gets found out? Picture the moment right before a decision gets made. Not the decision itself, but the half-second before it, when a voice rushes in to judge it. That voice sounds like reason. It sounds like wisdom. But if a person listens closely enough, carefully enough, they start to notice something unsettling. That voice doesn't actually sound like them. It sounds like a parent who once demanded perfection. It sounds like a teacher who measured worth in grades. It sounds like a culture that whispered, again and again, what success should look like, what failure means, who deserves love, and who doesn't. The voice feels internal, but it was installed from the outside, piece by piece, over years of approval and disappointment. And here's the strange part. Most people defend this voice as if it were their own conscience, their own moral compass, when really, it's an old recording playing on a loop, narrating a life that was never fully theirs to begin with. Think about the last time guilt crept in after doing something that brought genuine joy. Was that guilt truly a signal of wrongdoing? Or was it an inherited alarm system, built by someone else's fears? A person raised by an anxious parent often inherits anxiety as a narrator. A person raised in a household where ambition was worshipped often inherits a relentless inner critic that says rest is laziness. The mind doesn't usually question the origin of these voices, because they arrived so early, so consistently, that they became indistinguishable from personal identity. This is the deep trick of conditioning. It doesn't feel like conditioning. It feels like truth. And so the real work, the work that almost no one talks about openly, is learning to pause before reacting to that inner voice and asking a simple but devastating question. Whose voice is this? Really? Carl Jung once described this borrowed voice as part of what he called the complex, a cluster of emotional memories that operates almost like a separate personality inside the mind, hijacking thoughts at the worst possible moments. A good first step toward loosening its grip is something deceptively simple, keeping a short voice journal for 1 week. Every time that inner critic speaks, after sending an email, after a conversation, after a small failure, write down exactly what it said, word for word. By day 3 or 4, a pattern usually emerges, and most people are stunned to realize the phrase repeating itself is almost identical to something a parent or authority figure used to say. Books like Soul Without Shame by Byron Brown, or The Body Keeps the Score by Bessel van der Kolk, help untangle where this voice was formed and why it speaks the way it does. This isn't about silencing the voice completely. That's neither realistic nor necessary. It's about recognizing it the instant it speaks, so it stops being mistaken for truth. There was a man, successful by every visible measure, well paid, respected, who spent 30 minutes describing in detail how he'd failed his father by choosing a career in art instead of law. His father had been dead for 9 years, and yet the voice judging him in that room wasn't his own disappointment. It was his father's, still narrating, still grading, from somewhere that no longer technically existed. That's how persistent this borrowed voice can be. It doesn't need the original speaker to remain alive in order to keep speaking, which raises an uncomfortable question for absolutely anyone willing to sit with it. If every authority figure who shaped that inner voice disappeared tomorrow, completely, irreversibly, what would the silence sound like? And more importantly, what would be left to say once the noise finally stopped? A man walks into a room and instantly, without thinking, his shoulders straighten, his voice deepens, his face arranges itself into the expression people expect from him. He's not lying. He's not even fully aware he's doing it. He's simply playing the character that earned him love, respect, or safety years ago. And somewhere along the way, he swore, quietly and without ceremony, never to put it down. This is the part most people misunderstand about the masks they wear. It's not fear of judgment that keeps the mask glued to the face. Fear fades with practice, with courage, with enough uncomfortable conversations survived. What actually keeps the mask in place is something far stickier. The mask worked. It got applause. It got the promotion, the marriage, the approval of a mother who finally seemed proud. And nothing creates addiction quite like a strategy that has already proven, repeatedly, that it pays off. Think of the class clown who grew into an adult who can't sit in silence without cracking a joke. Even at funerals. Even in therapy. Think of the strong one in the family who has never once let anyone see them cry. Not because crying feels dangerous, but because being strong is the only role that ever earned them a seat at the table. These aren't people trapped by fear. They're people trapped by a track record of success. The character worked so well for so long that abandoning it doesn't just feel risky. It feels like throwing away a winning lottery ticket. And this is precisely why persona work is so much harder than people expect. Nobody willingly demolishes the one strategy in their life that has consistently delivered results, even when that strategy is slowly hollowing them out from the inside. Carl Jung warned that the persona, left unchecked for long enough, eventually convinces its owner that it is the entire self, not a role being played, but the only identity available. A useful exercise here is what some therapists call character autopsy. Sit down and write out in detail every situation over the past month where a specific role was performed, the dependable one, the funny one, the unshakable one, and next to each entry, write what emotion was being hidden underneath the performance. Books like Quiet by Susan Cain or Daring Greatly by Brené Brown offer language for separating identity from role, especially for people whose entire self-concept was built around being useful, impressive, or endlessly composed. The goal isn't to demolish the character overnight. It's to start noticing, in real time, the exact moment the mask goes on, because that moment of awareness is the only doorway back to whatever's underneath it. A woman once admitted, almost embarrassed by her own honesty, that she didn't know what her real laugh sounded like anymore, only the laugh she performed at dinner parties to seem warm and easy to be around. She'd been performing it for so long that the performance had quietly replaced the original. That's the real cost of a character that earns too much applause. Eventually, the line between the actor and the role disappears entirely, and there's no audience left to perform for except the one inside her own head. So here's a question worth sitting with for longer than feels comfortable. If every single person who ever applauded that character vanished tonight, would there be anyone left underneath to take a bow, or just an empty stage waiting for a script that was never really written by its owner in the first place? Somewhere in a quiet moment of comparison, scrolling, a person feels that familiar sting of falling short, without ever stopping to ask a far more important question, falling short of whose definition? Exactly? Every family hands down a ruler. Every culture manufactures its own measuring tape. One household measures a life in salary figures. Another measures it in marriage and grandchildren. Another measures it in degrees hung on walls, in titles printed on business cards, in how early someone wakes up, and how little they complain. And the cruel part is this: nobody ever sits down and consciously chooses which ruler to use. It gets handed over silently, in childhood, the way an heirloom gets passed down, except this heirloom was never asked for, and it rarely fits the life it's being used to measure. Consider two brothers raised in the same house. One who became a touring musician, living paycheck to paycheck and deeply fulfilled. The other who became a corporate lawyer with a six-figure salary and a quiet, simmering emptiness he can't quite name. At family dinners, the lawyer is praised. The musician is asked, gently but pointedly, when he's going to get serious. But serious according to what ruler? The lawyer is thriving by a measurement system built around security and status. The musician is thriving by a completely different system, one built around creative expression and freedom, except nobody in that family has the language to measure success along that axis, so his life simply registers as a rounding error, a disappointment, a phase he hasn't outgrown yet. This is where Carl Jung's concept of individuation becomes less abstract and far more useful, the lifelong task of separating who a person actually is from who they were trained to become by family, culture, and inherited expectation. A genuinely practical exercise is to write down 5 measurements currently being used to judge personal worth: income, relationship status, body weight, follower count, whatever surfaces, and beside each one, write down honestly where that specific ruler originally came from. A parent, a childhood church, a specific ex-friend's offhand comment from 8 years ago. Books like The Gifts of Imperfection by Brené Brown or Man's Search for Meaning by Viktor Frankl are worth reading slowly here, not for quick answers, but because they model what it looks like to build a personal definition of a meaningful life from the inside out, rather than borrowing one off the shelf. There's a particular kind of grief that arrives the moment someone realizes they've spent 15, 20, 30 years chasing a finish line that was never theirs to run toward, a goal someone else wanted, measured by a ruler someone else manufactured, in pursuit of a version of success that was never going to feel like home, even if it had been fully achieved. That grief is uncomfortable, but it's also the doorway. Because once the borrowed ruler is finally named and set down, an unavoidable question rises to take its place. If no one was watching, if no family member, no algorithm, no inherited voice was keeping score at all, what would actually feel like enough? That driver who cuts in line without signaling, who lingers 2 seconds too long at a green light, who seems engineered specifically to detonate someone's patience in under 5 seconds. What is it, really, that makes the reaction so disproportionate to the offense? A honk. A muttered insult, a flash of rage that lingers for the rest of the drive, replaying the scene long after the other car has disappeared. This is rarely about the other driver at all. It's about a mirror, an unconscious one, angled perfectly to reflect back the exact thing a person can't stand seeing in themselves. Carl Jung called this projection, and it operates with a precision that should be unsettling. The things that irritate people most intensely in others are almost always the things they've buried, denied, or refused to face in their own shadow. Take the person who can't stand scrolling past someone bragging online, the vacation photos, the humble brag captions, the relentless highlight reel. The irritation feels justified, even righteous. But sit with it a little longer, and a harder question surfaces. Is the irritation really about the other person's arrogance, or is it about a hunger for recognition that's been suppressed for so long it now disguises itself as moral superiority? The shadow doesn't announce itself. It hides behind judgment, behind disgust, behind the comforting feeling of being the reasonable one in the room. And it always points outward first, because looking outward is infinitely easier than looking inward at the part of the self that's been exiled and locked away. A genuinely useful practice here is what could be called the irritation audit, keeping a small running list for 1 week of every person or post that triggers a disproportionate emotional reaction, then asking honestly what trait is actually on display. Selfishness? Arrogance? Neediness? Laziness? The next step is the uncomfortable one, asking where that exact trait might be quietly living, underdeveloped or denied. Somewhere in personal behavior. Jung's own writing on the shadow, especially in Aeon, along with more accessible modern works like Robert Johnson's Owning Your Own Shadow, offer a structured way into this process without it collapsing into pure self-criticism, which is its own trap and solves nothing. A therapist once worked with a client who despised dishonesty above all else, couldn't tolerate even small social lies, white lies, polite exaggerations. Months into therapy, it surfaced that this same client had spent 2 decades lying to himself about a marriage that had quietly died years earlier. The mirror had been accusing him the entire time, and he'd mistaken it for a window looking out at everyone else's flaws. So here's the harder version of that question, the one worth sitting with longer than feels comfortable. Of all the people who manage to provoke real irritation on a regular basis, which one of them might actually be holding up the clearest mirror? And what, exactly, is it accusing? A jeweler examining a diamond never does it on a busy street corner, surrounded by traffic noise and shifting light. The work happens in a controlled room, isolated from vibration, because even the faintest tremor can distort the measurement of something that precise. Most people treat solitude the way they'd treat that street corner, something to avoid, fill, or rush through, when in reality, silence functions far more like that jeweler's workroom, a controlled environment where something delicate finally becomes measurable. The instruments used in laboratories to detect gravitational waves are kept in near total isolation for the same reason. Too much external noise, and the signal being searched for simply disappears into the static. This reframes solitude entirely. It's not a retreat from the world, not a spiritual escape hatch, not even necessarily peaceful in the way people imagine. It's calibration. A person who never sits in silence has no accurate way of knowing which of their desires are genuinely theirs, and which ones were absorbed, unconsciously, from the last conversation, the last scroll through a feed, the last comparison made at a dinner table. The noise of other people's opinions, expectations, and energy gets absorbed so constantly that most people can't actually distinguish their own internal signal from everyone else's static. Not because they lack self-awareness, but because they've simply never been isolated long enough to hear the difference. A workable starting point is shockingly modest: 10 minutes a day, phone in another room. No music, no book, just sitting. Most people find this excruciating at first, which says more about how loud their internal noise has become than anything else. After a few weeks, something interesting tends to happen. Opinions that felt urgent start to feel borrowed. Desires that felt personal start to feel inherited. And underneath all of it, a quieter, steadier signal starts to emerge. Cal Newport's Digital Minimalism and Sarah Maitland's How to Be Alone both offer practical scaffolding for this exact transition, especially for people whose nervous systems have been trained to treat quiet as a problem to solve rather than a tool to use. There's a particular kind of clarity that only shows up after the noise has been gone long enough, not minutes, but real stretches of it, day after day. Writers who isolate themselves for a draft often describe the same strange phenomenon. The first few days feel unbearable, almost itchy, and then somewhere around day 4 or 5, the sentences that show up on the page stop sounding like anyone else's voice. They start sounding, oddly, like home, which leaves an interesting question hanging in the air for anyone willing to try this experiment honestly. After just 10 days of real, deliberate isolation from outside noise, what might finally become measurable that's been impossible to detect for years under all that vibration? What would you do if you knew, with absolute certainty, that no one would ever find out? That single question, asked honestly, tends to expose more about a person's real character than any personality test, any resume, any carefully curated profile ever could. Would the workout still happen if there were no progress photos to post? Would the book still get written if no one ever read it? Would honesty still be chosen in a small moment where a lie would go completely undetected? Forever? By anyone? Most people, if they're being truthful with themselves, discover an uncomfortable gap between the version of themselves performed for an audience and the version that exists in the empty room where no one is watching at all. This gap matters more than it seems. A person who only exercises consistently when posting about it, who only reads books they can mention at dinner parties, who only practices kindness within range of someone who might notice, that person has built an entire identity on a stage, and stages, by definition, require an audience to keep functioning. The moment the audience leaves, so does the behavior. Real discipline, the kind Jung might have called an expression of inner necessity, operates by a completely different engine. It doesn't need applause to keep running, because it was never plugged into applause as a power source in the first place. A practical diagnostic worth running once a week. Pick one habit currently being maintained. Exercise, study, a creative practice, and ask honestly whether it would survive a week of total invisibility. No documentation, no mention to a single other person. If the honest answer is no, that's not a failure to feel ashamed of. It's simply useful data pointing toward where validation has quietly replaced motivation. Books like Atomic Habits by James Clear explain the mechanics of habit formation well, but pairing that with something like Epictetus's Discourses adds the missing piece most habit books skip entirely: the question of why a habit is being built in the first place, and for whom. There's an old story about a monk who spent decades perfecting calligraphy in a monastery that no visitors ever reached, in a region so remote that almost no one outside the walls would ever see a single stroke of his work. When asked why he bothered refining something nobody would witness, he reportedly said the work wasn't for anyone to see. It was for him to become the kind of person capable of that level of care. That distinction is the entire topic in a single sentence. So here's a question worth carrying around for the next few days. Of everything currently being built, practiced, or maintained in a life, which pieces would quietly disappear the moment no one was around to notice, and which ones would, against all expectation, keep going anyway? Right before hitting post, there's a flicker most people never examine, a tiny mental rehearsal of how the likes will roll in, how a specific person might react, how many comments will say exactly the right thing. That flicker happens before the action, not after, and that timing is the entire problem. Most self-help advice gets this backwards. It tells people to stop needing validation once it doesn't arrive, to let go of caring what others think after the fact, after the disappointment, after the post underperforms. But by then, the need was already fully installed, already running the show from the very first moment the idea was formed. The real work happens earlier, in that flicker, before a single action is taken. Picture an entrepreneur drafting a business plan who unconsciously writes every sentence as if a panel of investors is already reading over her shoulder, judging each word in real time. Or a writer staring at a blank page who can't get past the first paragraph because an imagined critic, a former teacher, an internet stranger, a sibling who once called the hobby a waste of time, is already drafting a rebuttal before a single sentence exists. The applause being anticipated doesn't even need to be real. The brain rehearses it anyway, and that rehearsal shapes the work before the work has even begun, sanding down its edges, softening its honesty, optimizing it for a reaction instead of for truth. A useful practice here is what some call the blind draft. Doing any creative or meaningful work once with the explicit, almost absurd rule that it will never be shown to a single living person. Write the journal entry that will be burned. Record the song that will never be uploaded. Cook the meal nobody else will taste. This sounds pointless on the surface, but it's precisely the exercise that exposes how much of normal output is quietly shaped by an invisible audience sitting in the front row of the mind. Seneca's letters, particularly his writing on living according to nature rather than opinion, and Marcus Aurelius's meditations both circle this same idea from a Stoic angle, that anticipating outside judgment in advance is its own quiet form of slavery. A sculptor once described destroying a piece he'd quietly been proud of the moment he caught himself imagining a specific critic's reaction to it, not because the critic's opinion mattered, but because he realized the entire piece had been built around predicting that opinion rather than expressing anything true. He started over, this time with no one in mind at all. The work that emerged was rougher, stranger, and far more honest. So here's a question worth sitting with before the next decision, the next post, the next plan. Whose imagined applause is currently steering this, and what would get made, said, or attempted differently if that imagined audience simply vanished before the first move was even made? Nobody hands over an invoice for fitting in. There's no receipt, no itemized list, no moment where the bill arrives and forces an honest reckoning, which is exactly why this particular cost goes unpaid attention for decades while still being paid, quietly, every single day. Belonging always has a price. It's just collected in currencies most people never learn to recognize. Hours spent performing interests that were never genuinely held. Opinions softened or hidden to avoid friction at a family dinner. Entire decades spent in a career chosen because it made relatives comfortable rather than because it made the soul come alive. The transaction feels invisible because nothing tangible changes hands, but something is absolutely being spent. Consider the actual math of it. A person who suppresses one honest opinion per day to keep a group comfortable, conservatively, spends roughly 365 small acts of self-erasure every single year. Multiply that across a decade spent inside a friend group, a marriage, or a family system that only tolerates one version of a person, and the total isn't abstract anymore. It's tens of thousands of moments where authenticity was quietly traded for acceptance. That's not a metaphor. That's an actual ledger, running in the background of an entire life, and almost nobody ever stops to audit it because the payments are so small individually that they never register as significant until the total comes due, usually all at once, usually disguised as a midlife crisis or a sudden unexplainable depression. A useful exercise here is a genuine cost audit. For 1 week, write down every moment a real opinion, preference, or feeling was hidden specifically to maintain belonging in a group, a relationship, or a family. At the end of the week, total it. Most people are shocked by the number. Books like Braving the Wilderness by Brené Brown speak directly to this exact tension, the difference between true belonging, which requires showing up as a real self, and fitting in, which requires constant, exhausting self-editing. The goal isn't to abandon every relationship that requires some compromise. Healthy connection always involves some flexibility. The goal is to finally see the bill that's been accumulating silently for years. There's a particular kind of exhaustion that has nothing to do with physical effort. The bone-deep tiredness of someone who has spent 30 years being whoever a room needed them to be, never once asking what it was costing to keep performing that adjustment. That exhaustion isn't laziness, and it isn't depression in the way it usually gets mislabeled. It's the accumulated weight of an invoice that was never going to stop accruing interest on its own. So here's a question worth running the numbers on tonight. Across the relationships that currently make up a life, which ones are actually being paid for daily? And is whatever's being received back in return still worth the price quietly being charged? Most people spend their entire lives terrified of one specific outcome, being forgotten. It shows up everywhere, in the need to be remembered as the funniest person at a party, the most accomplished sibling, the name people mention years later with admiration. But flip that fear over completely, and something strange happens. What if being forgettable wasn't a tragedy at all, but the exact condition required for a person to finally become real? Because the energy spent trying to be unforgettable to everyone is energy that's no longer available to be authentic to anyone, including the one person whose opinion was supposed to matter most all along. Think about it from a simple resource standpoint. A finite amount of energy exists in any given day, any given life. Every ounce spent curating an image impressive enough to be remembered by strangers, acquaintances, or even extended family is an ounce that's no longer available for depth, for presence, for the handful of relationships and pursuits that actually deserve the full weight of attention. A person trying to be memorable to 300 people at a wedding has none left over to be fully present with the one person standing next to them. This is the quiet trade nobody calculates in advance, with purchased at the direct cost of depth. A genuinely freeing exercise is to write out a short list. 5, maybe 10 people whose opinion of a life actually, truly matters. Not 500 online followers. Not a wide circle of acquaintances. 5 or 10 real names. Then, deliberately, consciously, give permission to be forgettable to literally everyone outside that list. This isn't about apathy or burning bridges. It's a redirection of finite energy toward the relationships and pursuits that can actually hold weight. Ryan Holiday's Ego is the Enemy explores this exact tension between the hunger for wide recognition and the deeper, quieter satisfaction of mastery that nobody else needs to witness in order for it to count. There's an old image worth sitting with, a single candle in a vast, dark field, surrounded by people who will never see it, who will walk past it without a second glance, who will forget it existed within minutes. And yet the candle still burns at full brightness, not because an audience is watching, but because that's simply what fire does when it's lit. Most people live trying to be a stadium light visible from every direction, exhausting themselves to be seen by people who were never going to stay anyway. So here's the quieter, more honest question. What would it feel like to finally burn like that candle instead? Fully. Completely. For the few who actually stand close enough to feel the warmth, and at peace with being invisible to absolutely everyone else? Imagine, just for a moment, every camera disappearing, every follower, every relative keeping score, every old classmate watching from a distance, every imagined critic, gone, all at once, completely and permanently. What would actually remain? Not as a fantasy of total isolation, not as some hermit's escape into the mountains, but as a simple, honest experiment, with absolutely no one left to perform for. What would still get done, still get built, still get said? That answer, whatever it turns out to be, is closer to the truth of a person than almost anything else they could discover about themselves. Living without an audience was never about isolation. It's about the rare, almost startling state where action and intention finally line up without needing a single witness to make them feel real. Every idea covered up to this point, the borrowed voice narrating decisions, the character clung to because it once earned applause, the ruler calibrated by someone else's definition of success, the mirror that quietly accuses through irritation, the silence that calibrates instead of merely escaping, the discipline that holds even with no witness present, the inner applause switched off before it's even needed. The invisible cost finally added up and confronted honestly. The strange freedom found in being forgettable to most. All of it points toward one single, unavoidable shift. Not a single dramatic moment of transformation, but a quiet, repeated decision made over and over to stop asking what the audience would think and start asking what's actually true. So here's the only question that matters now. What's one borrowed voice that's been mistaken for personal conscience for far too long? And what would change, starting today, the moment it finally got named out loud? What habit, performed only for documentation and applause, would either disappear completely or finally become real the instant no one was watching? These aren't rhetorical questions meant to be nodded along to and forgotten by tomorrow. They're an invitation to actually sit down, tonight, with a notebook and write honest answers. Because insight that never gets written down has a way of evaporating by morning, dissolved right back into the noise it was trying to escape from in the first place. This is the work. Not a single video, not a single realization, but a daily practice of separating what's real from what's merely performed, for an audience that was never actually watching as closely as imagined. If even one part of this resonated, if even one sentence landed somewhere true, that's not a coincidence. That's recognition. And recognition is exactly the kind of thing worth returning to, again and again, until it becomes permanent instead of occasional. So take a moment now, hit subscribe, turn on notifications, and come back for the next conversation. Because this particular path, the one leading toward a life with no audience required, doesn't end with a single video. It only really begins with one.